Very much, Deputy Darragh O'Brien and then Deputy Tony McLaughlin.
Yeah, thank you, Gráinne and Enda, for your attendance here today. And it's obviously an issue that this committee takes extremely seriously. Our first hearing post the general election of this committee was in relation to the refugee crisis and the wider crisis in the Middle East. And just a couple of comments and then one or two questions for you. I think some of us a couple of weeks ago were in Cairo and we had the pleasure of meeting the Secretary General of the Arab League. And Ahmed El-Gleid said to us that day, and I think it was actually telling, that the continuing imposition of Western-style democratic values on the Middle East is something that is not welcome there, that we just can't simply transpose what happens in Western Europe and decide to tell people in Libya, Iraq and Syria that this is the way that they should lead their lives. And I think all of us, when we look at solutions to this, should also look at the disastrous intervention carried out by both Britain, France, the US, other Western powers in Libya, in Syria and in Iraq. That has been the fundamental, one of the reasons for the current crisis. One of, and I think there are no blameless actors in this whole tragedy, and that is the problem. And I think that was something that was put to us very loud and clear. And I think all of us, when discussing this as well, is that Europe doesn't always have, and the West does not always have, the solutions. And our values are not always the only ones that are correct and should be the ones that would be followed. And I think if we were a little bit more cautious in our approach, when I say we, I say the West, over the last 20 years, we mightn't be dealing with the size of the crisis that we have right now. Now, that said, I would like to commend you for your work and your colleagues for your work and all the other agencies working in a terribly difficult situation that is an absolute catastrophe. And I wanted to ask you a couple of things. Firstly, on the resettlement programme, and Ireland has committed, you're right, and it's a modest commitment within it, but the European commitment, I think, is also modest. I'd like to hear what the UNHCR's view on Europe, the EU response to resettlement in particular. And I'd also like to know whether the UNHCR has a view on third country arrangements, such as the Turkish arrangement, and the move for another 15 arrangements to be put in place, where we're talking about an absolutely outrageous situation whereby 80,000 refugees are proposed to be resettled to Afghanistan. Now, I would imagine that the UN has a view on this. I would hope you do, and if you do, I think this I would be most interested to hear it. Finally, I would ask you to maybe, if you have a view or a comment on particularly the persecution of minorities. Anyone who's persecuted, and any death is abhorrent, but the systematic persecution, the genocide which has been perpetrated on people like the Christians in the Middle East, like the Yazidis and others, but that this focus on, when we talk about the horrors that the Syrian regime has vested upon their people, you've also got to look at what the so-called Islamic State, the Al-Nusra Front, and others who are supposed to be moderate in this as well, are carrying out against ethnic minorities in the region. And I think I would agree with you completely. Political solutions are what are required, and I welcome your comment that all of those who are involved would have to be, would have to be part of an overall solution. But I'll leave it at that. But thank you very much for your presentation this morning.
Let me start with Deputy O'Brien's questions, and I'll start first with the question of resettlement. What's fundamentally important to bear in mind with resettlement is that when you talk of a global refugee and displaced population which tops 60 million, and if I go specifically to my region of the world and repeat again the figures for Syria, which are phenomenal. We're talking about 4.8 million registered refugees. The number of refugees that will have access to resettlement is always going to be a very small proportion of the refugee population. For the Syria response in particular, we hosted as UNHCR a high-level meeting on resettlement and other forms of humanitarian admissions in Geneva on the 30th of March last year. And the goal that our High Commissioner was aiming for was 10% of the total figure of Syrian refugees. So let's say somewhere in the region of 400,000 to 500,000 from within the Syrian refugee population. And a number of pledges were made at that meeting, including some new resettlement and admission pledges from countries that have not had a tradition of resettlement, the United Arab Emirates having pledged 15,000 places over the course of 5 years, being a new potential resettlement partner. As UNHCR, we are always looking to any resettlement country to increase the numbers. And indeed, the numbers for Ireland and for other members of the European Union are rather modest, but not insignificant numbers. Because what we use resettlement for, it serves a number of purposes. In part, it's simply an expression of solidarity, and it's sending the message to countries in the neighbouring region, the ones hosting the vast majority of refugees, that, look, you're not alone. We're also willing to step up and admit refugees to our own territory. So through a selection process which allows us to look at specific protection needs, that even small numbers of resettlement places are significant. Last year, out of the Syria crisis, recalling again that our High Commissioner had set the bar at this target of 400,000, out of the entire region of Middle East, North Africa last year, we submitted 96,000 submissions for resettlement. Submissions differ from departures and arrivals because we're submitting in one calendar year, and of course there is a time lag due to security clearance and other requirements. But 96,000 is the number we submitted from the region last year. And the largest of the resettlement countries, the ones with the largest quotas, would be traditional resettlement partners like Canada, the US, Australia. That said, the quotas offered by countries like Ireland and the European Union are significant. They are important to us, and we're always lobbying for higher numbers. But we will, whatever is on offer, we will use that to the maximum for refugees. In response to your question about different arrangements, you mentioned specifically the Turkish EU arrangement, and that is something that UNHCR had expressed concern about at the time, and we do continue to have concerns about bilateral and multilateral arrangements that affect the ability of refugees to gain access to safety. At the same time, a fundamental feature of what was happening out of Turkey at the time the deal was struck was, of course, these large movements of people by very dangerous sea routes, something that we see much less now in the eastern Mediterranean, but something we continue to see at quite significant levels in the central Mediterranean, particularly with Libya as a departure point. So we have a fundamental concern about the safety of life at sea, and this is something that we would encourage that any of these bilateral arrangements take account of that, and take account of adequate measures that ensure that refugees are not being unreasonably blocked or pushed back to situations of danger. But we do understand the motivation behind, the migration management motivations behind these specific arrangements that are being negotiated between states, and we stand ready to discuss with states and to offer our technical advice so that whatever deals are struck would be in the best interests of refugee protection. And of course, for us, the fundamental red line is the 1951 Convention's bar on non-refoulement, the forced removal to a situation of danger. So that's something we would always be looking out for in these type of agreements. On your last question with respect to the situation of minorities, the minority populations in the region have suffered greatly. The Yazidi, what has happened to the Yazidis with the flight of almost the entire Yazidi population from the area around around Sinjar in northern Iraq was, of course, something that garnered a lot of media attention. Many of those Yazidis continue to live in camps as internally displaced persons within Iraq, and many of them are also displaced to countries in the region. For the refugee side of the minority response, the appeal that I referred to would, of course, include the needs of minority populations. But it is important to underline that many of the minorities, be they Yazidi, be they Christians, many of them remain, some of them still in their homes, but some of them as internally displaced both within Iraq and Syria. So the funding appeals for those internal displacement situations are also in acute need of funding in order to be able to respond to specific needs of minorities who have suffered greatly.